All right, so we're going to be going over restealing from a rig who is ISOing a fish. It's a very common scenario. I'm sure you've seen it in a ton of your games. And the key to this is you just want to make sure that you're capitalizing in the right spots against the right opponents, and you are taking advantage of some of your mediocre to weaker hand ranges so you can turn them into profitable hands. So instead of folding a hand, like in this example, we have Queen 9, we're going to re-steal with it and win a pot. And you primarily kind of want to do this with hands that will have good floppability against your opponent's 3-bet calling range. It's not limited to that. In the right spots, you can do it with almost any hand, but primarily I would recommend, especially at first, as you're kind of implementing this more into your game, if you're not doing it very much right now, is to do it with medium strength hands that have some floppability, like Ace X little and Queen X and things like that. In fact, I'll bring over kind of a sample. It's not limited to these kinds of hands, but these would be some good hands to kind of start out with to use as a baseline when you recognize this particular play develop. So you have a lot of ace little suited, some big king and queen suited, some as well as some off-suited hands and small ace offsuit hands. So again, not those aren't the only hands you can make this play with, but those are great hands that if you do get called, you can outflop, or using your position, a lot of times you can see all 5 cards and outdraw your opponent's hand. So, um, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in this video, but there's a distinction between some of your calling range when a rig ISOs a fish. There are some hands that are great when you do have position on both the fish and the reg to go ahead and call, because your reg is going to be in a sandwich position post flop, and they're going to have to play pretty straightforward, or it's gonna minimize what they'd be able to do if it was just heads up and things of this nature. Being multi-way and not having ultimate position in the hand allows for some flexibility and creativity on your part. Another thing to consider is just when you're going to flat or 3-bet, and I talk about this a little bit more later in the video, but is your opponents that are behind you, in this case, that are in the blinds. We don't want to be squeezed very often, so we want to make sure that if we do flat some hands, that their hands are not going to have to just dump and forfeit all our equity pre-flop. So in this case, very common scenario. Uh, these stats, by the way, don't apply in this HUD. But a fishy player limps, short stack, definitely a fish. A reg ISOs that fish, and we 3-bet. And, typically speaking, it kind of depends on your reg's ISO raising size, but somewhere between 13 to 16-ish big blinds would be a good 3-bet size. We're definitely looking with these kinds of hands to increase our fold equity. We're not, you know, this kind of hand again has some floppability, but it's not it's a hand that we don't mind just taking down pre-flop, getting almost 7 big blinds without seeing a flop with this hand is fine, which in this case is what happens. And we'll go through some other examples, but this is a very common spot looking for situations in position. This is also going to happen a whole lot when you're out of position in the blinds, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. All right, so going to go over another very common situation of a potential reg ISOing a fishy player. And there's a few different things that you need to consider when you're deciding if you want to re-steal or you're going to be flatting. Once you recognize that fishy player limps and a potential reg ISO raises, you want to make sure that you understand a couple things about your position. A, of course, in this case, in position, cut off your hand strength and the opponents that are behind you. The more aggressive the opponents are behind you, you definitely want to be tightening up your flatting range. You want to make much more definitive decisions, meaning three bet or fold a lot of your hand range. Not that you're not going to flat some hands here, but with a hand like ace 8 or king 9 suited or hands like this where you wouldn't really want to flat open yourself up to being possibly 3 bet, but you could re-steal with the hand by 3 betting yourself. So in this case, in the cutoff, we want to make very definitive decisions. We also know that our reg's opponent's ISOing range is going to be a little bit tighter, being in the hijacker middle position versus if they were in the cutoff or button. So all these things have to factor into your decision, and also how your opponent is playing post flop. So, a hand like ace 8, this is a hand where not gonna flat quite as often. Maybe if we were on the button, and it would depend on how our player plays, because once you flat behind a reg in a fish, you do a couple of good positive things where the fish will likely call more often, and the reg is going to have to play more honest, being sandwiched between you and the fish. I mean, he's not going to be able to just, you know, go crazy, and he has to worry about you behind him. So that's a positive. But also 3 betting, you could get the fish to call and the reg to fold. So there's a lot of different things that can happen. As far as hand range, like I was saying, ace 8 offsuit is a hand that has some floppability against an opponent's 3-bet calling range. So, if they call with 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, maybe even queens and things like that, you can obviously out flop or out turn them. So there's some good things on that note. You also take away some of their combinations of aces since you have an ace in this case. So a hand like this is a great hand to re-steal. You'll take it down pre-flop most of the time. This would be kind of a fairly common similar hand range, not just limited to this, but just some examples of some hands in a cutoff you might look to 3-bet if your opponent was likely over ISOing a fishy player. And you could open this up a little bit more even as you get on the button. And then, like I was saying, there are a number of hands you want to flat, and that will open up a little bit more as you get on the button. On the cutoff, like I said, you want to make a little bit more definitive decisions. But like suited connectors and things of that nature, especially on the button, more of a hand range like this, not limited to, but some hands that would be in there, suited connectors, some gapped connectors, king queen type hands. Now, of course, ace 8 is ahead of something like king queen, but this is also, these kinds of hands are more drawing hands, so you can make a few big hands if your opponent does have a fairly good hand himself, where he'll make 2-pair a number of times and you can make a straight, things of this nature. And again, having position, you can make sure that your reg who is ISOing has to play honest if you do decide to flat with hands like that. So position, of course, is important. We ideally would love to be in the cutoff or button, somewhere where we're going to be able to apply pressure to both opponents. But there are a number of situations out of position where this play is going to transpire. In fact, it's going to transpire a lot when you were probably in the blinds, because a pretty common scenario is, a fishy player limps or min raises or something in one of the first couple of positions, or maybe even the cutoff, and then your reg, someone you suspect is a regular in your games, ISOs them from the cutoff or button. And in this case, our reg's ISO range is going to be really, really wide. It's going to open up much more than in this scenario. So you can also look with a lot of the same range of hands to re-steal out of position. You just want to make sure you have a good raise size where you can increase your fold equity against your opponent. So whatever you would raise in position, you raise a little bit more, at least another, blind to 3 blinds out of position. And note that against some of your better regs, they're going to recognize and understand that you are going to probably re-steal against them if they know that they are ISOing a fishy player a lot, they know that that's going to start opening up your range a little bit. But some of your rigs won't really recognize that, especially in small stakes games like this. But some of your better rigs, maybe at 150 NL and stuff like that, will recognize this a little bit. Probably not as much as you go down in limits, so you can kind of take advantage of that. But there's pros and cons there too, because your opponent's calling range and how they play scenarios might be a lot tighter, so your fold equity might drop a bit. But regardless, you know, the majority of the time you're going to see this when your reg ISOs your cutoff and button. If you think about it, that's of course where you should be doing it the most yourself. So if you are in the blinds, you can open up your range a little bit and re-steal. So let's go over this specific hand real quick. So like I said, we have a fishy player that limps. Our potential reg ISOs a 3-bet, and 3-bet sizing, on average should be anywhere from 12 to 15 big blinds. In this case, we don't mind folding everybody out and picking up the pot here. Picking up 6.5 big blinds without saying a flop with this hand is not a horrible scenario. So, we're trying to look to risk the least for the reward, which we're just looking to re-steal the pot in this case. If a call happens, it's not, of course, the end of the world. We have position and stuff. So in this case, the fishy player folds, which is one of the disadvantages of making this play, and that's why when we have like the suited connectors and some of the king highs, some of the drawing type hands that will play well, it's nice to flat, just because we know our fishy player will, come along for the ride a lot of the time. And then we'll have position on fishy player and reg, and there's a lot of advantages there. In this case, our opponent doesn't fold; he calls. See a 6-high flop. In this case, we're obviously not going to fold out a lot of mid pairs. Things like eights, 9, 10, jacks, obviously queens, any of those types of hands. None of those are going away, or if our opponent's slow playing. But we can get some of their calling range, maybe like ace 10 suited, ace jack, maybe some king queen type hands, which we don't mind keeping in the pot because we have decent equity against. But again, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen, if we get those hands to fold where they're killing our equity, that's a huge plus. So I think c-betting here majority of the time and trying to get our opponent off of most of that range will work. And most of their 3-bet flatting range that they would check here, they're probably not going to check raise, unless they were trapping. So something like 8s, 9s, 10s, things like that, they would still call here. We still have potential to outdraw our hand by the river, because a lot of times what will happen if they do call, turn will go check, we can decide if we want to bet or not, and then we end up being able to see 2 cards for this price and fold out our opponent's some of the range that's actually crushing us at this point. A couple other notes is we have a couple backdoor draws. So with to the 8 and to the wheel. So our opponent does call. We hit an ace on the turn, which is great. Again, just as suspected, our opponent checks. Here is one of those in-between spots. Kind of depends on what you want your gameplay to be and how much history. In this case, no history with opponent, so I think checking is more appropriate because we don't know exactly where their range is. They may even decide to call with something like ace queen or whatever, so we really have no idea. So in this case, we can check behind. If they bet the river, depending on the sizing, we can call or fold. But if they check, we're definitely betting, and we might be able to squeeze value from something that thinks we might be bluffing, like 9s, 10s, jacks, things of that nature. So do check behind. I don't think betting here is horrible, but I think you're bet folding if you do. Board's so dry, it's completely rainbow. So river's pretty inconsequential, really, unless our opponent has something like 7-8. But unlikely since we also reduced the combo of 7 8 with 8 in our hand. Our opponent checks. Now we're definitely going to look to value bet. We want some kind of sizing that looks, maybe he's trying to bluff, but we're not committing ourselves obviously in any way. If we get shoved down, we're folding, but we're looking to get called from, in this case, tens, jacks, maybe eights. Obviously, eights are a stretch also because of our hand. But mostly tens and jacks we're looking for, which plays very consistent to what opponent's hand is. In fact, I think in this hand, which was only a couple days ago, I think I put them specifically just on tens and jacks. We do get a call, and I do flip over tens. So, from start to finish, this is the way you recognize the Resteal spot. You make sure that you get a hand that can outflop your opponent's 3-bet calling range. You play it in a manner that you can squeeze as much value as possible, and you increase your profitability. So this is one of the common scenarios where you're in the blinds and a reg ISOs a fish in position. You're going to see this a lot. In this case, we're in the big blind with ace-10 offsuit, which is still a pretty good hand, but trying to play it out of position against two players is going to be difficult unless you have some really good reads. So in this case, the stats actually don't apply to our opponents, but we have a fishy player limp in the cutoff, a reg, ISO raise, and then 3-bet and take the hand down. Ace Jack, hands like that you might consider flatting. Some other hands depends kind of on stack sizes and how aggressive your opponent is and reads and stuff like that. But that's a common scenario. If I had King 8 suited or Ace Deuce offsuit or Queen 6 suited, things like that, I would make the same play in that scenario. So, but that's the typical dynamic that you'll see, and you want to capitalize it. And you also want to make sure it's in the flow. Like if you've been super aggressive lately, or you've been 3-betting the reg, in this case, who's on the button a good amount recently, it's not a play you're going to want to make. So you just want to make sure you have good rhythm and timing with when you're doing things. It's you need to recognize the scenario. B, you want to make sure that you are in a good rhythm and flow in the game, and that your image you're projecting isn't going to create somebody to play back at you at the wrong time. Those are all really important things to being successful with that play. So a quick summary review. Ideally, of course, you want to be in position. This will, of course, happen a lot of times when you're at a position in the blinds because your reg at your table will be ISOing when they have position. So, you still want to take advantage of that, but of course, you want to take advantage as much as possible when you're in position, because when you start 3-betting your reg, he's going to start reacting, and hopefully he's going to make some mistakes at the wrong time. You want to look for regulars who are over ISOing fishy players. So every time a fishy player limps or makes a min raise, that kind of stuff, they are raising them a lot. So their range is getting really, really wide here. And be aware that some of the better regs are going to understand this too and play back at you. Don't make that or allow that to deter you, but just be aware that you're going to have to be a little bit careful against some players versus other players where you might be able to abuse them a little bit more. Use kind of the marginal part of your range that we talked about, some ace littles, some king 7 suited, queen 9 suited, those kinds of hands. And use that especially as you're implementing this more into your game if you haven't been doing it a lot. This way it'll allow you to kind of outflop, or like we said, you can kind of have a good chance of seeing all 5 cards in a lot of these situations. Sometimes you won't, of course, but there's higher potentiality for that happening. Make sure you have a good flow and there's a good tempo of the game. You haven't been playing like a maniac and three betting this particular player a lot because, of course, you're going to expect them to play back at you. So, if your primary goal is to pick up the pot pre-flop, that's not going to happen if you've been super active. So you want to be aware of that, and of course, have good sizing. If you're looking to get a fold pre-flop, you're going to increase your fold equity by having a good enough size to risk the least amount as possible, but make sure you do get that fold. So that may vary opponent to opponent or situation to situation. Um, there's sometimes you're going to have to increase your raise size a little bit more against certain opponents that maybe don't fold to three bets as much. And against other opponents, you might be able to size it down. So just consider that because all those things do add up at the end of the day. And good luck with your game.